Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a Sunday evening. I know it's not exactly the greatest of times, but I thought a Sunday evening might be best because all of us are relatively freer before we get back to work on Monday. My name is Srikrishna Ayyangar. I'm a member of the faculty at the National Law School of India University in Bengaluru. I also chair the public policy program. I am a political scientist by training, but I've also been a public policy educator for a decade and a little bit more. For today's webinar, Can Knowing the Law Make Better Public Policy? We invited two global policy experts. I'm honored and both delighted to actually have them. It's a rare privilege actually to get both Ron and Shimal as part of this webinar. I'll start with Ron. Ron Abraham was one of the co-founders of an organization that many of you will know called ID Insight, and who was part of its growth in India for a little over a decade. Today, ID Insight is a 250 plus staff organization working in evaluation and monitoring and helping government in public policy making, and is spread over many countries across Asia and Africa. Ronald is currently building Veera, spelled VEERAA. It's a crowdfunding and growth platform for India's community leaders. It's a very interesting and an exciting venture, and I hope many of you should Google it up if you can find, if you have an interest in democratic participation. Earlier, he's also served as the CEO of the Jan Swaraj Foundation, and under his leadership, the JSF built an active network of around 25,000 youth across Bihar. He holds a BA honors in economics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi, and then he did a master's in public administration with international development at the Kennedy School. Shimal Kapoor is also a public policy expert. She's a law and public policy professional with nearly a decade of experience working at the intersection of governance, regulation, and technology. She began her career as a Lamb Fellow in the Indian Parliament and later served as a judicial clerk at the Supreme Court. And before she moved on to also do a public policy program, a master's in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Since her master's, she's worked in many public policy engagements for leading technology companies like Meta and Probo. And she's focused on privacy, content regulation, online safety, online gaming, telecom laws, AI governance, and digital competition. So thanks, Ron, and thanks, Shimal. I could not have asked for more. I deliberately wanted to choose the both of you because both of you work in public policy, are leaders in public policy in India. And one of you has a law background, one of you does not have a law background. And both of you have had some, if not a lot of, probably as much, if not more experience with the National Law School of India, right? So, and the reason I wanted to sort of have this conversation, of course, we have is to open up this question. And the question is the following: why should one study public policy at a national law school or at a law school? You know, this is a question that we're faced. So, which leads us to a question, which is why should public policy have any relationship with law at all? You don't really hear it, and so I have an answer. Me and my colleague Devyani wrote an article a couple of months ago about whether law is required, and the argument we're making is law is not it's known to look like an MBA, but it's not exactly an MBA, and law is required. But that's our point of view. I wanted to hear from people who have been working, and I'm really curious as to what the both of you think about the question of law. And there maybe we're at 6:12, so maybe we can go till 6:35 with some discussion between us. If you and Shimal are okay, I have a few questions that I'd like to ask you, and then we can open it up for questions from the audience, if that's all right. Shimal, would that be okay with you? Okay, great. So let me ask the both of you the following question. Do you think law has any role to play in public policy formulation or in implementation? And if so, what kind of a role does law have to play in public policy making? So I'm going to start with a very broad and open question. Does it have any role to play does knowing the law help in sort of policy formulation and policy or program implementation? And maybe I'll go with Ron first and then Shima. Would that be okay? Ron, what do you think?
Thanks, Krishna, for having me join this really, really interesting webinar. And good evening to everyone who are here taking their time out on a Sunday evening. Yes, I mean, at a very, very high level, I think the answer is an unequivocal yes. A strong understanding of the law is actually really, really useful and important when it comes to policy formulation and policy implementation. And I actually wanted to kind of break this up into kind of two pieces. When we think about policy making, there is kind of the big picture policy making, which is designing policies and laws and programs and projects from scratch. And then there's the tweaking piece, which is am I audible, Krishna? Just checking. Yeah. Okay, great. And then there's the tweaking, there's kind of the second bucket, which is that there are existing policies in play, but we can continuously evolve them, improve them to ensure that their on-ground impact can improve. So on the first bucket, I think at a very, very high level, any kind of policy making needs to understand that when you are working in India, you're working in a context with a strong deficit of state capacity. And so um, from the side of those who have a stronger legal backing, who are, let's say, lawyers or judges or come from a legal point of view when it comes to policymaking, it's useful to understand the lack of or the deficit in state capacity in India when formulating policies. Often I have seen that people coming from a more legal background can sometimes make the mistake that passing a law or formulating a policy that is law compliant is in of itself sufficient for the law to be implemented. And often they forget kind of the important things that need to be tagged along that, which is budgetary allocation, administrative feasibility, capacity, and perhaps most importantly, political will. There are multiple examples when the laws exist, but the programs or the policies on the ground doesn't exist. Kind of one interesting one that I always think about is that a lot of policy implementation on the ground suffers from the constant circulation of IS officers. And the Supreme Court has, I think, in either one or two judgments, um, uh, very clearly articulated that all senior positions in government, IS positions, IPS positions, should not be circulated beyond, I mean, it should have a stability of 2 or 3 years. But the implementation of that law from the Supreme Court is still completely missing in practically every single state in India. And the states in which they are being implemented well, they were being implemented. There was stability in IAS tenure that was there even before the Supreme Court came in. Now, the obvious, I mean, the thrust of our conversation today is not thinking about state capacity and its lack thereof when it comes to lawmaking, but perhaps thinking about the law when it comes to policy making. I think there are kind of three big areas where ensuring that you can have a more legal underpinning to policy formulation improves the on-ground impact of policymaking. I think one very clearly is addressing the issue of temporariness. I have been part of various policy projects that do not have a legal underpinning, and they have often fallen apart because of the problem of temporariness, or they have changed dramatically because of that. The Aspirational Districts program is one that I've been part of. The National Data Analytics program is one that I've been part of, and I can kind of, and there are much smaller ones as well. And these are kind of all policy interventions of national importance and scale, but without a legal underpinning, which ultimately leads to them losing their teeth and over time kind of just suffering and degrading into kind of not existing. Another big thing that legal underpinning allows is usually funding. So whenever you're thinking about policies from a development point of view to improve to address poverty, to improve health, improve education. Funding is a big important aspect. And without a legal underpinning, it's very hard to get that stability. And then finally, kind of related to temporariness, is that without legal underpinning, you're always dependent from a policy point of view or a programmatic point of view of a champion, of an individual idiosyncratic champion, without kind of the backing of a stable law that will ensure that things can survive across individual champions. So I'll just pause there, and I'll just kind of summarize by saying that baking law into policy formulation when you're trying to improve outcomes on the ground is critical, and therefore having a strong understanding of how the law works is critical if you want to be a policy practitioner, while at the same time having a strong understanding of the law without a good understanding of the context in which law operates in India, which is a broader context of state capacity deficit, is also kind of detrimental for how things will work on the ground. So I think it does go both ways.
Fair enough. Thank you, Ron. Shimal, what do you think?
So I think Ron's answered a very sort of realistic perspective of how law acts as a foundation for policy making and implementation. I think I'd like to talk more about, the supply side of things, in the sense that my perspective's always been that, but before I do that, thanks for having me, Krishna, and thanks for everyone, being here on a Sunday evening. I can think of many better things that everyone could be doing on a Sunday evening, but I'm glad we're all here, convened. So I want to answer this from two perspectives. One is my perspective as a lawyer, and then one is my perspective as somebody that's, moved more into policy work, even though, of course, I continue to identify as a lawyer in some senses. But I think that, the law can supply policy, and policy sometimes also acts as a substitute for laws when laws are absent. What I mean by this is, I'm going to take two examples here. So I think the first is Vishakha versus State of Rajasthan, which was a Supreme Court judgment that very basically gave effect to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in India. So the Supreme Court at that time supplied a policy to protect women against discrimination in the absence of a legal framework. Now, this typically would have been the domain of policy making, but it's actually something that the legal framework sort of stepped in to supply. And as a lawyer, I've always thought about this particular case a lot. When I studied it in my first year of law school, I was very struck by the fact that this is a very unorthodox way of policy making, where literally the judiciary is stepping in to make law or make policy in that sense, right? Because typically judiciaries across the world are supposed to interpret and apply the law, not necessarily make it. But then policy also ends up supplying the law. And a very good example of that really is the whole conversation around privacy and the right to privacy as a fundamental right. Now, I come at this from the perspective of someone who's worked in technology policy, and so privacy there very specifically means data protection. But as any lawyer would really understand, privacy is much more than just being safe in your online data. And if you look at how the Puttaswamy judgment that conferred the right to privacy in the first place, and then sort of led to where we're at now, for example, with the online privacy law, which is the DPDP, or Digital Personal Data Protection Act, you see that there was a lot of demand from companies and advocates in the technology policy space asking for a right to privacy as a basis to have some sort of data protection legislation. So I think it's sort of a symbiotic relationship that law and policy share, because we wouldn't have had the Puttaswamy judgment if we wouldn't have had a demand for a data protection law. So I like to think of it as that. And I will say that in that sense, they can't really exist without without the other. They're very symbiotic. And myself, being a lawyer and somebody that's done a master's in public policy and then worked in both law and policy in India, I can say that it's definitely helpful to know, like Ron was saying, the context from which the law comes. But it's doubly helpful in policy making, because you're also, as a lawyer, then able to, for instance, identify the gaps in the law, right? With policy making, you wouldn't really know where to start unless you knew where that gap can be filled. And that's something that I think even now we struggle with, right? For instance, we do have a fairly lean sort of architecture right now for a lot of issues that come up in technology policy, for example. And that's something that, for instance, the whole world is grappling with right now when they look at frontier technologies like AI, not knowing how to regulate them. And why it's important to regulate them, I'm not biased in this direction because I'm a lawyer, but I've realized that ultimately, for any human society to function, the rules of the road need to be extremely clear. And in that sense, I'd say the law really helps understand what the future of businesses, the future of technology, the future of really which direction we're headed in as a country, for example. Those are all facets of policy making and of business decisions. But the law is sort of really important to set up the guardrails within which these things can operate. And I think ultimately, even when you're making, for example, an ask before government, right, such as the data protection example that I gave, if you don't know where the basis for a right to privacy comes from, you would not be able to argue for a new policy to be formulated. So I think that from a policy formulation and implementation perspective, I think Ron covered the implementation side really well. But even from a formulation perspective, I think the law is an essential feature of creating any policies.
Sure, thanks. So thanks, Shimal. So the way I understand what you're saying, Shimal, is that in some ways, from your perspective, law acts as the foreground, the guardrails for policy. And for Ron, law acts as one dimension because state capacity is as much, if not more, crucial in formulation and implementation than law itself. But both agree that law is a critical dimension to policy making, and I'm okay with that idea essentially because, in fact, in most public policy education in India, law is a missing dimension. And it's focused mostly on economics or social or communities, but there's very little emphasis on law. And my only claim is that law should be one dimension, even if not the foregrounding dimension, certainly one dimension among many other dimensions. I have a
Krishna,
question.
I would just want to add to that. I think that the law also cannot exist without policy in the sense that
Hmm.
for any law to even be formulated, though it needs to be informed by things like state capacity, economic considerations, harms versus benefits. I think those things do sort of go into the formulation of the law as well.
Sure. Okay. Fair enough. So you mean you need a law in context kind of a sort of thing. It's not just being a lawyer. So I'm going to just pivot to you, Shimal. Just another question because we have just another 10 minutes before we open it up. And Shimal, the question to you is, now that we know that, let's assume that law is an important or a important part of public policy as a career, should you be a lawyer? Is it do you have to be a lawyer, or can you because if you're saying law is important, then it's a bit like the public health question, right? Should you be a doctor to be in public health? That kind. It's not, I don't know whether it's the same thing or it's even similar. But if we feel that law is critical, is it important to be a lawyer, or is it enough if you have a good sound knowledge of the law? I don't know how. And Ron, this question can apply to you as well. I mean, because you've been at a sort of executive level where you probably would have hired lawyers, or might not have hired lawyers. And so in some sense, the question is to the both of you, but maybe Shimal can answer first and then we'll go to Ron. And the question is essentially the following. If law is important, does it mean that only lawyers can do public policy, or can people from other programs or other backgrounds pick up the law necessary in a public policy program?
So I think it's a slightly nuanced question because I've come across a lot of folks in my field that I would say are not lawyers, but are still very adept at the art of public policy in that sense. And then I've come across a lot of lawyers who are extremely good lawyers, but are not adept at the art of public policy. So it can be a slightly difficult question to answer. I would say that it really depends on what sphere of policy you're operating in. So for example, as a lawyer, you have some advantages. So for instance, if the government puts out a legal document that is highlighting the direction in which the government is thinking about an issue, sure, being a lawyer is an advantage because you can, read the fine print and you can understand what the government is trying to sort of do between the lines, right? Or what the intent of, like the legislative intent, quote unquote, would be of a certain policy or a framework. But I think it's not an essential skill necessarily because in my experience as a lawyer too, I had to unlearn a lot of my legal training to become a policy professional. And that in some senses, my master's in public policy really helped me do. Um, and this is absolutely not not a comment on legal education itself in itself, but I think that when you're a lawyer, your legal education and experience as a lawyer lends a certain sort of idealism towards the importance of the law, and I think you end up not necessarily understanding the other issues that can that can plague the implementation of a law, for example, or the ability of a law to be effective. So, for example, you might not know why a certain law is working or not working if you don't understand the local context of the people over there, right? So, for instance, there was back when I was doing my policy program, there was a lot of thinking about nudge economics and direct benefit transfers and the advantages of DBT, etc., versus subsidies, for example. As a lawyer, I only knew the ideological arguments, but then when I went to policy school, I understood that there's a lot of economics that goes into thinking about it. So that formalism needs to sort of sometimes be unlearned because you don't necessarily understand the on-ground factors that might be limiting the ability of the law to solve the gap. And I think that's where that interrelationship that I was hinting at comes in. The other aspect of it is also that sometimes you think more like a regulatory policy person in the sense that you might want to then focus more on regulation. And I've actually found that lawyers can seamlessly transition into that ability to interpret the legislative intent, for example. But ultimately, I think what you end up needing is today, the MPP, at least in my opinion, is the sort of degree that confers this idea of expert generalism on anybody that does that degree. And you need an expert generalist who can traverse and straddle multiple worlds. So it's not just law and policy, but you also need to be able to understand the realistic impact on society, on people, whether the uptake for a policy, for example, will occur or not. But you also then, for instance, if you're working in policy, public policy that impacts corporates, for example, you need to then think a little bit about business incentives or, innovation. What are the things that you'd want to sort of incentivize companies to do, or what might, for example, hurt a company's ability to grow in a certain environment? So I think that it ends up being an advantage in some situations, but I don't think it's a necessary requirement.
Sorry, Ron. Yeah.
I can jump in. Yeah, I can jump in. I think, I mostly agree with a lot of what Shimal is saying. It definitely depends on the sphere of policy that you're working in. And what I think behooves a good policy professional is, if you're not a lawyer, to understand the strong role a law or the legal underpinning for a policy can actually have in progress on the ground. Because if we take a step back, kind of what we're really caring about is progress or outcomes on the ground. And there are various policy formulations or programmatic formulations that governments undertake that have a loose legal underpinning or are essentially borrowing their kind of legal status from some other law without, and it's kind of just a project, as I was just saying. And so policy, in my mind, does exist sometimes without strong clarity on what the legal underpinning is. And on the other side, there's also obviously kind of every law in of itself is declaring a policy statement as well. And which is why, we can go back and forth on how much of it is foundational, how much of it is one dimension. But I think what matters most is that, like, if you are working in health, it's very important to understand the various laws around that. If you're working in education, very important to understand the various laws around that. If you have to be a good professional. So, but to say that, where I would maybe differ a little bit with what Shimal is saying, and in general, I've seen this kind of an argumentation coming, is that, when you, as I think Shimal said actually herself, that when you come from a very clear legal background, you see a lot of questions from an ideological point of view or from only a legal point of view, and sometimes miss its practical aspects on the ground. So when the Aadhaar case was being fought, folks who were essentially saying that Aadhaar should be put aside, had kind of an internal argument, which is, should we be taking to the court the point around the lack of privacy, and that is why we think Aadhaar should be put aside, or should we talk about all the various ways that because of Aadhaar's implementation, social welfare benefits have suffered on the ground? And ultimately, that internal conversation resulted in a lot more primacy being given to the privacy argument. because that is what they knew would hold sway in the Supreme Court, because it's a stronger ideological and legal point than the practical point that millions of people were not getting their social welfare benefits, despite the fact that when you actually look at kind of what millions of people care about is much more whether they are getting those benefits, or rather than whether their privacy was infringed upon. Not to say one is right or the other, but to just say that if you have very clearly a legal point of view, you do miss a lot of those practical aspects. But if you have very clearly a programmatic um, point of view, a stronger kind of contextual point of view and experiential understanding, you would miss kind of all the different ways that you can use or leverage leverage the law to make progress on the ground. So to me, a good policy practitioner understands both pieces rather than only one. And whether you start from a legal training or a economics training or a political science training or as Shimal said, a generalist expert training of a public policy professional, the understanding of law is important. For me, it's necessary and not sufficient. I think we can all roughly agree on that. And I think that's the way to think about it. It's not necessarily whether only lawyers can make a particular type of policy or not. And there may be specific cases, such as like privacy policy or other policies, where actually a strong understanding of the law is probably almost a prerequisite. But when for various other pieces, a stronger understanding of the industry you're part of is probably more important or equally important.
Fair enough. I think the way I understand Shimal is, yeah, you do need to know law, and the problem that lawyers typically face is that they might not have a heterodox approach to law. It's not contextualized. It's a certain way you understand law, and you want everything to fit into that way of your understanding of law, which probably will not work in public policy. And Ron's point is well taken, which he's been saying, which is that it's one dimension among many other dimensions. And the dimension that it brings is the fact that it can provide some level of sustainability or stability to a project which is otherwise probably subject to all kinds of pressures, logistical, financial, political, and so on. So I just want to ensure that we keep our conversation to the time that we have, because it is a weekend and I want to respect that as well. And so we have time till around 7 p.m. today. And so I'll stop questions. I had some more, but I think just in the interest of time, it's good to stop me asking any more questions. And we can ask the audience to if they have any questions, to just type it in the chat window, and that would help us. There is a chat window, so if you can type your question in the chat window and who you would like it to be answered, who you would like to answer that, who would you like that question to be answered, that would be helpful. So if you have any questions, please go ahead. You can just type your questions in the chat window and some of us will respond.
Srikrishna, there are some questions in the Q&A tab, if you can go.
Oh, there are? Okay.
There's something called a Q&A
Yeah,
tab.
I just checked. Thanks, Rajgopal. Just checking, yeah. So, I don't know, can you, Ron and Shimal, can you see the questions in the...
I can. I think Rudra has written a couple of questions. They're not actually on the topic. So maybe we can come back to them a little later.
Sure.
In case, yeah.
So maybe the both of you can answer. So someone's completed their master's and they're debating whether they should do an LLB or an MPP. Anyone or both of you can answer. You might have different answers.
I can take a stab at it, having recently taught at NLS, as you're aware, Krishna, and speaking to a lot of students that were both doing LLBs and MPPs, and Ron can jump in as well, of course. But my perspective on this is that I wouldn't think about it like that. I think both degrees have their own benefits. What I would actually do is invert the journey a little bit, and that's how I've always taken career decisions. For example, like for instance, where would you want to be 5 years from now? I think that's sort of the first question to ask yourself, or 10 years from now, in that sense. Whom would you want to model your career after? I think that's the way that's where I would start. And then, you sort of work in reverse and you reverse engineer the decision and think about whether an LLB or an MPP would offer more value. I think ultimately, of course, doing an LLB is a good pathway to, for instance, entering the legal profession. But I'd say that having done a master's in economics, um, I think that a lot of the things that a master's in public policy would give to you are probably in some senses overlapping. And I would think a little bit just about specifically what sector you'd want to work in. I think that's a good place to sort of think about these questions. So just as an example, I have a lot of, a lot of my students at law school are also at the law school when I was teaching, were also asking me questions about how they should think about their internships and future career decisions that they wanted to make. And that's the advice I gave most of them, where the question really was that, do you see yourself being in a legal field or do you see yourself being in a more so for instance, would you want to be in public health or do you want to be in technology policy, etc.? And I would just go into that direction in particular. Basically, that if you wanted to, for instance, be an intellectual property rights person, you wanted to be a lawyer and you wanted to do policy making therein, I would just then do the law there and then concentrate my studies in that direction. But I think that both would be valuable. In terms of what are roles that are close to government and policy making, I'd say that the government in that sense is pretty good about consulting a whole variety of stakeholders. And they don't only consult with, legal experts and policy experts. A lot of times they'll also consult with economists and with folks that have established expertise in their fields. So I would think a little more about what direction you see yourself heading in, specifically what field you see yourself being in, and working backwards from there.
Ron, your thoughts? You want to respond?
Sure. There's also a question from Manogna Matam, which is on similar lines. So I'll
Sure.
probably just add, and it's actually kind of speaks to a little bit of what I want to add to what Yamal was saying. I think if you're an early career stage professional, you are right now sometimes not really sure of which is, let's say, the sphere that you want to enter in. What I think sometimes works better at this stage, if you're a couple of years into your career or even you've just done your undergrad, is to think through kind of what are the kinds of skill sets that you would like to hone over the next few years. Some of you absolutely love writing, some of you absolutely love analyzing, some of you love working with data, some of you don't like working with data, some of you love communicating, some of you love being with having people skills or having people oriented roles. Just kind of think through those pieces. And that actually will help a little bit also, in addition to kind of thinking about the areas that you want to work in, the impact you want to have, in terms of understanding what kind of more further studies you want to do. If you and this also speaks to the question that Manogna you're asking, which is, what are some skills folks will benefit from it when engaging in the craft of public policy when one has a legal background. So she has already done a law degree and is now thinking of training in either economics or public policy. So I would say that there are three broad sets of skills you should always think about: communication skills, people skills, operational skills. And sorry, four, I guess, technical skills. And everyone needs communication skills. So, and a law degree is excellent at honing that. Not because that's what law is focusing on, but I've never seen a lawyer who's not good at communicating. So that's actually just really, really strong from there. But in terms of whether you want to have a very people-oriented profession or a very technically oriented profession, and if a technically oriented profession, whether you want it to be strong in analytical pieces or in other pieces, math or non-math, scientific or not. These are, I think, the ways to start thinking about various kinds of degrees. And then within that, I would say also once you take up a degree, you also have a lot of choices to make. So that's, I mean, I'd without knowing a particular person's specific context, I find it hard to give any more specific advice on that. So I'll just pause there. I see no questions, but I think they're in the chat maybe.
They're in both the chat and Q&A.
Both
So,
channels. Yeah.
So I think you've covered the idea of the skill sets required. Unless Shimal, you want to add to the skill sets that Ron was talking about, or do you
Yeah,
want to move
I
to
would
the-
actually, I would
Sure.
actually like to add to that, just a little bit. So the reason I actually did a master's in public policy was because I had zero understanding of, in some senses, hard skills that are required to do policy making. So, for instance, I had very little understanding of numbers. I didn't know how to read statistics. I didn't know what double-blind studies were. I didn't know any of these things going into public policy. And that's mostly what motivated my decision at the time that I was applying for my master's. That the choice was between doing a master's in law, an LLM, versus doing a master's in public policy, and both paths were open to me. And I ended up picking the master's in public policy because I realized that it'll give me a lot of these skills that I did not have as a lawyer. And I think ultimately, what Ron was saying is, really important to consider that what are the skill sets that you think you would not be able to acquire without formal training, and what are the opportunities that each program opens for you? I think that's always worth thinking about. And for me, it was really important to sort of get out a little bit from my legal bubble because I wanted to think about policy from a more holistic point of view. And I will say that even after I finished my master's in public policy, I did work as a lawyer briefly. But I would say that my perspective was vastly enriched and much and significantly broadened as a result of doing a master's in public policy.
I just want to answer the question by Phalguni, which is like, so basically, it really doesn't matter. Public policy is a mix of many disciplines, and it doesn't matter. You can just mix and match and come into certain career. That's, I think, is not what we're trying to argue. Yes, it does involve a lot of disciplines, but those disciplines have to be integrated in a certain structured manner. That's the point. Because if you don't integrate those disciplines in a structured, thoughtful manner, you're not fast tracking your progress to contribute in public policy. Public policy is of course an emerging sector, and there are more number of people in public policy who don't have public policy degrees, right, than the people who have public policy degrees working. That's the reality of how it's functioning in India. Now, having a public policy degree tends to fast track your progress and your professional contributions in that public policy sector. While there'll be enough people who will keep contributing to public policy, being a doctor, being a lawyer, being an anthropologist, being whatever, if you want to fast track your contributions, having a certain multidisciplinary background helps you fast track your progress. And the evidence is right in front of you. Mr. Ronald Abraham, Ms. Shimal Kapoor, where they are because of a public policy degree, in addition to the fact that they have an undergraduate degree in some other discipline. If they didn't have those public policy degrees, they would not be where they are today. I hope I'm making sense, right? So you do need a public policy degree to fast track your contribution in public policy while knowing that all disciplines matter in public policy. We have a few more questions, which is, so there are sub questions about technology law, technology policy, and environmental policy. I think the questions are essentially, is it good to do an MPP or should you pursue it as a lawyer? What is your take on this? Shimal, would you like to answer that question? I mean, there was some question about, please go ahead.
So I think one thing to consider really is, and I'm going to sound a bit repetitive, is really in terms of, where you want to end up and where you're coming from. So when I, for instance, went into my public policy program, I had no idea that I wanted to work in technology policy. I was very animated by the idea, the legal frameworks and the legal questions that underpinned technology regulation at that time. So for instance, I was very invested in understanding data protection and the right to privacy. I'd worked a little bit on, at that time, the net neutrality proposal as well that the government was considering when I was a LAMP fellow. And I'd say that, it ultimately just depends on what angle you would want to explore. So one thing I will flag is that in terms of my public policy class, and I think Ron can attest to that as well, was that it was a big mix of backgrounds. I had doctors, journalists, like people that were fresh out of like 3-year undergrad programs. In fact, there were barely any lawyers in my policy class, and I was one of the very few lawyers in my policy class. And interestingly, in my class at least, I'm the only lawyer that didn't go back to a career in the law. Everyone else that did, a law program combined with their policy degree or were lawyers that did public policy actually went back to legal careers. So I think it's really dependent on where you want to get to. And then at the same time, even working in the tech policy space, I'm not familiar with the environmental policy space that well, but even around me, I have a lot of peers that have not gone to either law school or policy school and are not even engineers, but are still in technology policy. So I think the question really that I would ask myself if I were deciding on what to do is, what am I curious about? What would I like to contribute? Which field would I like to contribute in? What's the kind of impact I want to make? And how do I make that impact? Like, what are the steps that I need to take in order to get from point A to point B? And that's how I would think about any career in environmental policy, tech policy, medical health policy, etc. The other thing I want to say is that public policy by itself is a very vast field. I think we don't realize it, when we're like in doing our undergrad programs or when we're fresh out of our undergrad programs. But even for instance, a bureaucrat is working in public policy. So ultimately, and a politician is also sort of in that sense doing public policy. A member of parliament is doing public policy. Think tanks are doing public policy. Academicians are doing public policy. So it really just depends on you trying to figure out where it is that you want to contribute and not thinking so narrowly about public policy in that sense. And I just want to give a small example here. NLS by itself, for instance, has done, I believe, various projects with technology companies, for example, where they've, run some programs on research on how, for example, AI can be leveraged to improve outcomes in consumer dispute resolution, for example. And that's not something that you would necessarily think of a core law school as doing, right? So I'd say that you want to think a little bit just about where it is you want to contribute. Because a lot of folks that I know, for instance, started their journey in public policy after a few attempts at the UPSC and not clearing it, and then realizing that this is something that they were very animated by. So that's the perspective I take. I don't know if there's a linear answer to it, but that's overall been my learning along the way.
Sure. So I just want to add one more. I mean, just as a there was a question about, will having a background in journalism be relevant in an MPP program, or having a UG in this, or should I be a lawyer? And I was listening to Shimal and saying, you can help contribute. I agree, but I want to inflect it in a different way. I think any background matters because public policy is essentially a program that amplifies your voice. So you can be a doctor and you can amplify your concerns in the public realm. You can be a journalist and you can amplify many issues of topical concern. So it's not a question of just contributing. It's a question of amplification. Now, the moment you enter the public space as a public policy professional, you get to amplify the power of your interests in that domain in much broader ways than you could have ever imagined before. That's the advantage of having that. So I just want to sort of emphasize that Shimal is using the word contribute, and I'm using it in the same way. And I'm saying that the contribution is amplification. It doesn't matter what degree you come from. The fact that public policy has the potential to amplify is what I wanted to sort of, just clarify.
I think I just wanted to second that. That's a very good framing. I think as Shimal said, people from various backgrounds are part of policy degrees. And, I have seen scientists there, I have seen doctors there. I came with an economics background. Shimal has come from a law background. And I think if there was kind of one way to think about it is that like you take these core skill sets and you get into public policy because it is a structured way of enabling amplification. I think it's a solid framing. You could be a biotechnologist and you could choose a career in public policy because that's your calling, where you actually care a lot about the application of science, biotechnology in policy, in its practical use cases, rather than being a core scientist who is in a lab and tinkering and creating new innovations. That's not to say one is better or more important than the other. It's just to say where your calling is. And I think that framing that you use, Krishna, is actually quite a useful way of thinking about it.
Well, you put the words in my mouth, structure change for amplification. Thank you, Ron. I mean, both of you have helped me frame it in a particular way. I do find a lot of questions which are more general around related to the law and I'm not sure whether we would have the time to get into those kinds of questions. If you have any questions about public policy, let me say teaching or curriculum at NLS, because we just have another 5 minutes, I'm happy to answer those as well. But more generic questions, this might not be, we won't have enough time to get into those kinds of, very broad questions. Shubham, if you have a question, we can't unmute you, but if you could type in your question, that's good enough for us.
I think there's one question from Aparna that might be useful.
Go ahead, Ron, if you can answer it.
No, I think Shimal will be great for you because she says that and there are 2-3 people who've plussed on it. So I think it's a question many have.
Sure.
She says that she's a practicing advocate in constitutional law. She has been finding public policy interesting, but before she takes the jump, she would like to know if there are other part-time courses or online resources that she could go through to get a flavor before deciding to do a full master's. I think maybe either of you could take that.
I think I'll let Krishna speak to if there are any offerings from NLS, and then I can give a more general perspective as well.
So NLS, Aparna has some what are called, certification courses, not in public policy, but there are courses related to health law, business law, security law, and so on. So they're more applied courses that you could. They are not necessarily public policy courses, but they're essentially, courses that apply law in a particular context. I just want to answer that, but I can answer the different question. But Shimal, you should answer the other online resources if you want, and I'll come back.
Sure. Well, when I was a law student, I did actually at that time. Again, I'm talking about a while ago, and not a lot of lawyers in that sense were. Public policy was not a default career option for lawyers. Even when I was graduating, I was the only person in my class that was going into public policy. So I had actually at that time done some sort of workshop, I think, that the Takshashila institution used to offer. Fair warning, I didn't actually end up completing that course, but I remember when I was doing the course, I found myself realizing that there's a whole bunch of dimensions to public policy that I was not aware of, such as things like thinking about economic considerations, statistical implications, etc. And I'd say that you can maybe look into workshops of that nature. Krishna, I think it's great feedback for NLS to also consider actually offering some sort of certification program, because these low friction programs that can actually expose somebody might end up sort of setting them into that trajectory. I don't know if those programs still exist, for instance, at the Takshashila institution, and I cannot speak to the quality. Frankly, back then I didn't end up completing the course either. So again, can't speak to the quality of the course I took. But it did definitely sort of set me thinking a lot about these things. But I think that to Aparna's question, I would look at, in addition to courses, I would maybe look at reading a couple of books that might sort of expose you a little bit to that way of thinking. When I was in law school, we used to have this course called Law, Poverty and Development, which was really important in terms of thinking about things like developmental economics and policy making, etc. And I actually ended up really enjoying that course because that was the first time we were thinking about that relationship between law and public policy. But I do remember also reading, Esther Duflo and a bunch of these folks when I was in law school, and reading some of these books, watching some of their interviews, or just simply reading the impact that they had with organizations like JPAL, for example, for me was inspiring enough to think about a career in public policy and gave me a lot of insight into what public policy would look like as a career. So maybe that's a good starting point. And I think Ron's also given some advice over here. But yeah, maybe before you commit to a full-time course, you could do some sort of workshop or a certificate level course to see if it's really for you. But fair warning, with these workshops and certificate level courses, I would not in any sense argue that they're substitutes for a full-blown course. I will say that there was a world of a difference between, doing an online course versus actually going for an MPP degree. So, and obviously like the MPP degree was far more impactful in that sense. So that's the only caution I'd give you.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think one small other kind of trick is to just go to the curriculum sections or the syllabus sections of the MPP courses at NLS and any other institute you're considering, because just reading through the syllabus or the curriculum will give you a strong sense of the various skill sets you're going to gain from that. And then you can kind of take the call like, okay, yeah, these are actually, because you sometimes may lack the language to know what you don't know. And so that would actually give you a sense of, okay, yeah, I can actually do policy analysis, I can do policy program evaluation, I can do budgeting, I can do people management. There's a whole range of things that you can learn in a structured way at an MPP program. And one simple way to know that is to just peruse the websites of these programs to understand the course offerings.
Yes.
And yeah,
oh,
sorry, I want to just
Go ahead.
also say something that Ron mentioned about the MPP program at NLS. I was teaching a law elective at NLS where I had a bunch of students from the policy program, and like they told me that it was actually very helpful for them to attend some of the electives that were law electives at NLS to think a little bit about technology regulation, for example, because the course I was offering was on technology law and governance. But my MPP students had no legal background whatsoever. Most of them were fresh out of their 3-year, 4-year degrees. I'm not sure what the degrees length is now in Delhi University, etc. But they found the program at NLS very helpful because they were also exposed to a lot of other related ideas that enhance their perspective.
Sure. I just want to add two, three things, Aparna. I would say, I think your name is Aparna, the person who was the constitutional lawyer who's thinking. One is, write to me. I will send you 1 or 2 or 3 books, the names of 1 or 2 or 3 books. Read those books. Get a sense of what these are just texts that, I don't have them, but I can tell you the names. I think more than an online course, read those texts because those books are the texts that they will typically tell you in an online course. At least you have these books that you can refer to. 2, online, and I agree with about what Ron and Shima, online and a 2-year MPP are they're not comparable at all. Because, and I say not comparable for the following reason. Essentially, public policy is pivoting a certain attitudinal shift in your disciplinary training. It is focused so crucially on application in a context that it takes some time just to rework our thing. I'm a political scientist by training. I have had to, and all of us have some disciplinary background. All of us have had to. The point about public policy is essentially to bring an attitudinal shift, to think through structurally through abstracts, to apply it in a context. And that orientation you can only get in physical engagement, I sense, more than you can learn skills, but you need to know how to apply those skills in a particular context, for which I'm more of an advocate of an MPP anywhere, not just NLS. And I got a question from a senior professional, Ms. Pearl D'Souza, about she's 34, she's already a public health professional, and you want to know whether you want to get into public policy. I would encourage you to think of a doctoral program. You've already got a public health professional, you got a master's degree, you want to integrate the two. You don't have to go through another master's. Try to think of a doctoral program. Hire a few lawyers, very happy to engage with you if you've got enough experience. You don't have to, if you've already got a master's, we have a doctoral program in public policy. You should consider applying for it if you want to, where you can do some coursework and also get a doctoral degree in the process. Yeah, I can't think of any other. Well, we're at 7:01. I would say I think we should just stop in the interest of time. I'm happy to suggest those books. I mean, you can email me or you can email the admissions office, and the admissions office can redirect those mails to me, and I can.
Krishna, if you have them off the top of your head, you can put it in chat as well.
So yeah, sure. So one is, it's there's one book. So there's a classic book. This is for economics. It's called Weimer and Vining Policy Analysis. There's one by Andrews Pritchett. It's called Building State Capacity. This is it's a OUP book. It's freely available. You can think about these 2 books. Yes, you have many books by economists, but Weimer and Vining is the nuts and bolts of how you do public policy. It's really the econometric knowledge that will give you, while nudge and poor economics give you a certain perspective, they don't tell you how to do it as much as, the Weimer and Vining book will tell you. If you want there are many other textbooks, but I think if you want to start off, you can look at the Andrews Pritchett book, Building State Capacity. It gives you a sense of what it means to work as a public policy professional without much technological, baggage behind it. And Lance Pritchett and Matt Andrews have been writing a lot, but this would be a good book. There's also a book called a World Development Report, 2004, called Building State Capability. And there's another book in 2006, World Development Report, called Growth and Equity. These are some books that you can kind of look at. There are many books, but maybe a good book was to start with is the Andrews Pritchett book. Okay, well, it's 7:03, and I guess I will have to close just in the interest of time. And so thank you very much, Ron, and thank you very much, Shimal. And I hope you found this way of sort of thinking about law and economics, and I look forward to more conversations.
Thank you to both of you, and thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you. Good evening.
Yeah.
Likewise, thank you.